My name is Bia Labate, and I am a chief editor at chacruna.net. This conference is a co-production between CIIS and chacruna.net. I want to thank all the volunteers that are making this conference possible. We have a series of announcements, but we'll leave for later. Just want to remind the panelists that after their presentation, please stay on stage because we want to take an official photograph. As Janice had informed this morning, we apologize for the technical issues that didn't allow live stream, and we also recorded as people due to CIS policies not to record the presentations. And I want to welcome you to this continuing conversation on our journey here today. And I'm going to pass the word to our moderator, Katie. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bia, and it's so awesome to be here. I know everyone is very excited for this conversation we're about to embark upon. So one little quote I wanted to start you off with before, we'll get into some announcements before we get started. We do want you guys to notice that there are some changes between what is presented. Oh, thank you. Is that better? Gosh, it's so weird to hear yourself on a mic. Whew. So yes, there are some changes to the order of the panel presentations. We did have some last minute instances that kind of changed things. We are only going to have 4 presenters on this panel, all of which are male. We do acknowledge this and we do want to recognize that. And note that it's also a work in progress that we have these conversations and bring diversity and different perspectives continually to these spaces. So we recognize this, we know that you all recognize it, and we just want to call attention to that. Additionally, we do want to mention that, like Bia said, there will not be any recording available, but we do hope to be funneling some questions from the audience after the presentation, so do keep those in mind. We'll have time to pull 3 specifically immediately following everyone's presentations, and then after that we'll see where the conversation goes. And I think we all know all of our panelists at this point. Let me get our order properly so I can make sure to mention everyone. We'll be starting off, of course, with Bathje, who I don't see. There he is. We all love and adore Bob. Bathje is the convener of the Council of Spiritual Practices. Following Bob, we will be having a presentation from Rick Doblin, Executive Director of MAPS. I love how everyone's excited. And then Geoff Bathje, did I say his name right? Bathje. Gosh, I'm going to get it one of these days, Geoff. I'm so sorry. And then David Nickles will be our final presentation. So please be keeping notes, pay attention. I expect a very fantastic conversation after everyone's done. And with that, I'm just going to start us off with a tiny little bit of framing. So hopefully engage, all of our presenters and also all of our audience members. It is not accessible. If it is not accessible to the poor, it is neither radical nor revolutionary. This is a quote that has kind of guided my own work in activism and drug policy over the last, 20 years at this point. So I'm hoping that we can keep that in mind as we have this conversation, because the psychedelic renaissance impacts everyone, not just one group in particular. So we want to make sure that we're remembering everyone involved, not just those who are having certain medical needs or certain spiritual needs. This is something that impacts everybody. And the psychedelic renaissance is happening in the context of massive global change and global transition. So it's not just the states that we need to worry about. It's not just our policies here that we're trying to worry about. We're trying to keep this in context of literally every single human being and plant being on this planet. So with that in mind, I'd like to invite Bob up to get us started, and we'll see where things go.
Thank you so much. And to the people who spoke this morning, I just want to confess up front to a sense of overwhelm when I'm reminded how much is at stake and the potential value of the things we care about, the responsibility that comes with carrying that knowledge and know-how forward. I'm very grateful for the company of friends who are committed to the same thing. It might be helpful to remind ourselves of the diversity in this room along professional dimensions. A little optional show of hands. If you are a psychotherapist or a psychiatrist or a physician, a mental health care provider licensed, would you raise your hand for a minute? If you're a lawyer admitted to a bar, could you raise your hand for a moment? If you are, if you think you know a bit about the law, raise your hand. Let's see, if you're a venture capitalist or have been a venture capitalist, would you raise your hand? I know of at least there's 2. Good, non-zero. If you have been a C-level, an executive level person in a venture-backed corporation, would you raise your hand? A couple. Okay, the purpose in calling this out is we're going to be using some specialized language. And if you use language that's specialized in one profession, you may think that you're communicating with people who don't share that profession, and you might actually be talking past each other. So it's good to keep that in mind, listeners and speakers both. I'll do my best. If I say something that sounds really confusing or it doesn't seem to fit, please interrupt me and tell me. I happen to be on the board of one of the nonprofits working in the psychedelic space called USONA. Just want to say that up front. But I'm not here representing USONA or any other organization. I'm here presenting my own views, my own concerns, and my own murky crystal ball glimpses of paths forward. You probably all heard of the statement on open science and open praxis. The URL was up on the screen during lunch. And I'd like to describe to you how it came about. And I'll do that first with this slide, just acknowledging a few people that I consider to be elders, mentors, teachers, exemplars. If you can't read, I'll read the names. Walter Houston Clark, Aldous Huxley, Brother David Steindl-Rast, Willis Harman, Lisa Bieberman, Ken Barnes, Myron Stolaroff, Bob Schuster, Roland Griffiths, Bill Richards, Ralph Hood, and plenty of others. And some of these people have really taken me under their wings over the years. And what I'm going to say up here is largely out of dedication to them and the sense of a strong calling to pay it forward. Here's another way of acknowledging what has come before us. I brought some hefty items of show and tell. What's in common in these books is that they are written by, or they have chapters by, people who have done very significant work in the psychedelic field. And they have taken, in some cases, literally their entire life professional output, or very close to it, and have made it available as a gift to the world, or for nothing more than the cost of a book. Or if you want to see them in person, the cost of a workshop. But what has been absent is the notion of patenting, or the notion of keeping trade secret, or the notion of, I've discovered a good technique and I want to be the most popular or the best paid therapist, so I'm not going to share my technique. These people have done the opposite. They've given the world pretty much their all. This is an anthology called Higher Wisdom. I'll just read the names of the contributors. Ram Dass, Betty Eisner, Jim Fadiman, Gary Fisher, Peter Furst, Stan Groff, Michael Harner, Albert Hoffman, Laura Huxley, Zalman Shakir Sholami, Alexander T. Shulgin, Ann Shulgin, Houston Smith, and dear Myron Stolaroff. Exhibit 1. Myron Stolaroff's book, Thanatos to Eros. Tom Pinkson's book, Flowers of Wirracuta, A Gringo's Journey to Shamanic Power. Houston Smith, the theologian and philosopher, Cleansing the Doors of Perception, his life's accumulated observation of the unfolding psychedelic scene. Sasha and Ann Shulgin, their book Tikal, also the companion Tikal, and others you probably know about. Thank you, Brian, for the very special copy that you've lent me for this hour. Ralph Metzner, a principal at one time at CIIS, a longtime friend of the university and a friend of many of us, who in a never-ending series of books has released his life's accumulated wisdom for the benefit of all. Jim Fadiman's The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide, his best condensation of what you need to know if you are seeking some kind of a spiritual experience or creativity enhancement or therapy or just seeing what's out there. Here are better ways to do it, free or for the cost of a book. An anthology. Thank you, Bia and Clancy. The Therapeutic Use of Ayahuasca, from people who have spent their careers, professions, vocations, finding knowledge, honing their skills, shared with the world. a new book, Psychedelic Psychotherapy by R. Coleman. And Shulgin says basically, this is the book I wanted to write and would have been proud to have written it. It must be on the bookshelf of every therapist who presently does this work or hopes to do it in the future. A person's life experience, price of a book. Given to me a few hours ago by Elizabeth Bast, Heart Medicine, A True Love Story. There's a new book by a guy named Michael Pollan. You may have heard of him, who in endlessly entertaining prose describes this guy named Al Hubbard. Al Hubbard is surely the most improbable, intriguing, and elusive figure to grace the history of psychedelics, and that's saying a lot. So you may or may not know, Hubbard is the guy who really kind of nailed down set and setting, that the bright fluorescent lights were not helpful, that the white lab coats were not helpful, that music might be helpful, that a kind, gentle touch might be helpful. And as he did this, he, at his own expense, quote, moved between these far-flung centers of research like a kind of psychedelic honeybee, disseminating information, chemicals, and clinical expertise, while building what had become an extensive network across North America. Pardon me one sec, I'm getting some papers. Here's another contribution. This is a paper from the learned journal called Synthesis. It's a journal on chemistry from 1999. This is by David Nickles and Stuart Frescas. And the title is Improvements to the Synthesis of Psilocybin, and then a facile method for making something else. But the key thing here is that two people who knew how to synthesize psilocybin put time and money, government money and a private grant, into improving the method and put it in a learned journal. Now, for the non-lawyers in the room or people that don't know much about intellectual property rights, it turns out that when you publish something, it cannot then be patented. Once it's placed in the public domain, and there are a whole variety of ways of placing something in the public domain, it becomes freely available to everyone, and nobody can stop anyone from using that information. So the talk is a bit out of sequence here. Let me show you the counterpart to this public domain improvement to synthesis of psilocybin. Oh, I'll have to read it to you. Let me just undo that. So this is a patent application before the United Kingdom Intellectual Property Office. The title of the patent goes like this: Preparation of psilocybin, different polymorphic forms, intermediates, formulations, and their use. So there's an entity, and actually I think there's more than one. I'm not going to name proper nouns because anything you could say about one proper noun, there's at least one other entity in the world that is taking a tack that is different from this stack. Now, the patent may or may not hold water. It may or may not be granted. It turns out that many patents that are granted turn out to be weak patents. They don't actually give you very much. Patents in any event are expensive to enforce. So until this is made public, the content of the patent, we won't actually know whether it will have an impact on the psychedelic world. But I at least can make inferences, and they're really just that, inferences, about why somebody would file a patent in the first place. So I said this is out of order a little bit. Let me go back. Throughout 2016, 2017, I began to have an uneasy feeling when there appeared on the horizon a number of organizations, I counted 4, that were smelling the psychedelic renaissance. And I'm going to try to use neutral language here. And let's just say we're looking for ways to enter the space, be active, and by inference, get big. Now, that's the neutral framing. I don't want to necessarily ascribe motives. It could be because if you scale very rapidly, you can build what amounts to a large franchise, think Starbucks, you can deliver a lot of pretty good coffee in the world, okay? There can be a good reason for wanting to do that. There can be another reason, depending on who's behind it, where the capital comes from, what the expectations of the investors are, and that could be, ooh, here's the next big gold rush. Let's homestead, let's take out our territory, let's patent what we can, let's figure out the regulatory apparatus and try to jigger the regulations in ways that allow us to serve preferentially. So again, I'm not naming names and I'm not ascribing motives. We should just be aware of what the possibilities are. It will be helpful, I think actually crucial, to note that there are at least two forms of competition. One form of competition is where everybody competing wants to be the best they can be. And there's probably even part of them that wants the other people to be the best they can be. Think of the Olympics. You know, if you got a silver medal, you might be really disappointed, but I'll bet there'd be a part of you that would be thrilled for the person who got the gold medal, because that was so beautiful. And, you know, I'd like to believe that athletes at some level actually help each other. That's a useful kind of competition. It gets us to the finish line faster, with better quality, and ideally, if the sporting is done in a sporting fashion, we're all at some level helping each other. There's a different kind of competition. This kind of competition I'm going to put under the label of interference. It's where you take steps not only to be the best you can, but you take steps to slow down, retard, block, interfere with, kick dust up in the face of people that might be eating into your potential market. So if anyone has a better word than interference, please call it out. I'm happy to entertain it, but I think that's the most neutral word. And I think a lot of people in business would agree, yeah, part of their job is to interfere with the competition. You get big in part by keeping the other people small. That's the form of competition that it pains me in the psychedelic arena. It pains me. I feel it in my gut. And I'm somebody who usually thinks feelings. That's a feeling I actually feel. Feeling that month after month spurred me into action. I was kind of kvetching to colleagues saying, somebody do something about this? We don't know about these entities. We don't know what they're going to do. They're talking about intellectual property. Somebody do something. And somebody said, well, why don't you do something? So I did. And that led to the statement on open science and open praxis, which has now been signed by a very healthy number of researchers, practitioners, psychedelic societies, philanthropists, service organizations. And if you are significantly involved in the field, you're welcome to sign too. There's no discrimination in who can sign. So I wanted to let you know where it came from. In closing, the words profession and vocation used to mean something very deep, and I'm not sure they do now. Sometimes we say professional is like anything you do for money or anything you do that you're serious about. But beyond that, the old school professions in the olden days, my young years and before me, I think meant service before money. The doctor is there to treat you. And the doctor also needs to pay the rent, pay the mortgage, have a good life, but they're primarily there to treat you. And if somebody shows up at the doctor's office and says, I need treatment, but I can't afford to pay this month, if that doctor is an independent business person, they have the authority right there to change the fee or to say, don't worry about this one, get well soon. What happens when the control and the money move further and further from the people being served and the community? The doctor and the patient are both in the same community. They probably have friends in common. Their kids might go to the same school. There's all kinds of checks and balances in how you behave and what generosity looks like and how reciprocity plays out. What happens when the locus of control moves to a different state or a different country? I can tell you I have one friend who's a licensed mental health care professional, happens to be working at the moment inside a corporate mental health service, and she told me very recently she might be transferred to another facility. Well, how's that? Oh, well, somebody in my office called corporate. There's that actual phrase, somebody called corporate. Corporate is making a reallocation, a reorganization. I might have to leave here. Why do I care about this for psychedelics? While, I very happily use a smartphone every day, and the smartphone is the product of fierce competition. Maybe not this one, it's a couple generations old, but in general, this fancy face recognition stuff, you bet there's patents up and down. Samsung and Apple sue each other for billions of dollars over patent infringement. Years in court. Lawyers make a lot of money. Guess what? We get better smartphones. Two things to say about it. One is nobody here, to my knowledge, is actually presently living in third world circumstances. And it's quite possible that people who are living under third world circumstances, this is either way over their heads, or the consequences are actually in their drinking water and in their soil, and they don't like it. But in general, I'm not super conscious about those things. I'm a little bit, but not super. So I go around using my smartphone and no complaints with Apple and Samsung trying to outdo each other and even patenting their inventions along the way. Why do I feel differently about psychedelics? Well, I'm guessing that you do too. When given under propitious circumstances, with a measure of grace, some would say, they fairly reliably lead to experiences which are frequently beyond words and frequently change lives. When that phenomenon occurs, it is my wish that that happen in the best possible, cleanest space, being held by people who are very clear about their motives and for whom their work is a profession. They are doing it out of service. Money may be necessary to make things work in the background, but they are not motivated by money, and they will treat the people that they are offering this experience to with the deepest of respect and with the largest amount of autonomy that can be given to them as either licensed or lineage holding carriers of their tradition. So that is the hope behind open science. If we have time for questions now, I'm happy to take them. If I've gone over, two, great.
We have 2 minutes left, but we'll take questions at the end.
Okay, well, why don't we start now? I think that's enough.
We're taking questions at the end of every.
Oh, thank you. I misunderstood. So I cede 2 minutes to the group. Thank you.
Just a minute. The people that are standing, we have some extra seats. You can come and take these seats that are put as reserved. But if you want to sit down, that's your chance. Right here.
Great. Well, it's. I'd like to thank Janice and Bia and others for organizing this conference. I think it's very. Thank you. Very topical and timely, and a lot of really good issues have been raised. So I'm Rick Doblin from MAPS, and I'm very impressed with this stack of books. And I think what I can say from this, all these books that are describing different therapeutic approaches to psychedelics for decades and decades, all of this has been put in the public domain. So the fears that for-profit companies will somehow or other be able to patent psychedelics for psychotherapy, I don't think is realistic. I don't think they'll get use patents on psychedelics for psychotherapy unless they do something novel, unless they do something that's not in these books. And in which case, if they do something novel, then they may be able to patent that, and then they may be the only ones that can use that. And I think that's not inappropriate. I appreciate the concern that Bob has about how these are very powerful tools that have profound spiritual implications. And I think that it's quite possible for multiple different corporate contexts to actually deliver really effective treatments for the millions and millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people that need these therapies and need these treatments. So I think this is a good example of how the therapeutic use in many, many different contexts, developed by Stan Groff, refined by us, refined by Hefter and Bill Richards and others, that we're in pretty good shape, that this is going to stay in the public domain. I think the paper that Bob showed from Dave Nickles about the synthesis, one approach to synthesizing psilocybin, there's a lot of approaches to synthesizing psilocybin that are also in the public domain. And I think that those are never going to be able to be patented. However, if some company, either profit or nonprofit, develops a way to synthesize psilocybin that's novel, that's not only novel, but maybe even elegant, maybe even economically more efficient than other methods, then they're able to patent that. And I think what we need to realize too is that there's two different kinds of things that are going on here. In terms of the product, there's the product, but then there's also how does it get into capsules, how does it get into tablets. So there's a lot of specialized knowledge that comes with making a commercial product. And that has never been done before in scale. Even Sandoz, that made psilocybin and made LSD for research purposes and made fair amounts of it and put it into tablets and things like that, they weren't using modern machinery. They were developing it in ways that can potentially be improved on. And that can take a lot of money to improve on these things. So there are things that I think can be patented in terms of the actual process of making a medical product. And whether we're for that or against that is one of the things we're here to talk about today. I personally think that that's okay. If somebody wants to patent, if they develop novel situations, novel things, they can patent that. So I don't think that that falls into what Bob was talking about in terms of interfering. If you've created something, if you're the origins and you want to be the only one to use that, that's your opportunity. That's the opportunity here that we have, that people have. That's not necessarily interfering with other people developing their own methods. So what I want to read to you now is something that explains a little bit about what MAPS. I'll get to these slides a bit later. But MAPS actually hired a patent attorney to develop an anti-patent strategy. I saw what happened with Ibogaine. We've talked about Ibogaine before. MAPS was started in 1986. Howard Lotsoff and others started a for-profit company, NDA International, to develop Ibogaine into a medicine. And they started in 1986 as well. And their attitude was that we're not going to be able to raise as much money as we need. We're going to do this in a for-profit context. And they got a use patent on Ibogaine for the treatment of opiate addiction, and eventually for the treatment of other addictions. What happened from that was a disaster. They started doing different research with different people. Different people started trying to claim intellectual property. Then they started suing each other, and there was massive animosity, lawsuits, and the entire development of Ibogaine was destroyed for decades and decades by this fighting for-profit. And I think that's a good example of the kind of thing that Bob was trying to avoid and to help make not happen. But that did happen. And fortunately, those patents have now expired, the use patents that Howard Lotsoff took out. And so if anybody does want to develop Ibogaine or Iboga, and if you want to do it in a BD context or in a medical context or whatever, that can be done without worrying about use patents. So I didn't want that to happen to MDMA. So I hired the exact same attorneys that had developed the use patents for Ibogaine, and I said, help me come up with an anti-patent strategy. So nobody could ever patent MDMA for anything. And as Bob said, what you do is you put stuff in the public domain. That's the way that you make it so that somebody else can't claim that they were the inventor. So we have a whole section on our website for accounts of healing, all different stories of people that have used MDMA for different things, some unlikely things. Some people have gotten over physical concerns, allergies, rheumatoid arthritis, all these kind of things. And so we get these stories, we publish these stories on our website, and now they can't be patented for that use. So what I wrote about that was, my first hope, obviously, was that no use patents for MDMA were in existence. Less obviously, I hope that there was already too much written about MDMA's therapeutic potential for anyone, MAPS included, to patent its use. The goal of MAPS is to facilitate research with psychedelics and to help develop their medical uses, not to corner any market. If any well-funded pharmaceutical company thinks they can profit from MDMA by sponsoring research and gaining FDA approval before MAPS does, I want them to feel free to step right in and do so. However, if MAPS does succeed in securing FDA approval to market MDMA for some clinical indication, sales might generate some financial return which could be used for further research consistent with our nonprofit agenda. Perhaps MAPS could even become self-funding, a possibility that will certainly be a relief to those of you whom I repeatedly ask for additional donations. So I wrote this in 1992, so 25 years ago, and that's exactly what we're doing now. The one thing that was different then than now is that it's amazing sometimes how much you can think you're an expert on stuff and you could miss some really important things. So one of the things that I didn't realize until about 6 years ago is that Ronald Reagan, not normally a hero in any way, but he signed a law to create incentives for developing drugs that were off patent. And so you can't give patents if patents have already been expired or if their stuff's in the public domain, but it's called data exclusivity, and I'll show you a slide about that in a second. But what it means is that if you get data exclusivity, that means that nobody can use your data to argue for a generic drug for a certain limited period of time. In the US, it's 5 years. In Europe, it's 10 years. In the US, if you do studies in pediatric populations, which the FDA is requiring us to do, you get an additional 6 months of data exclusivity. And then it takes the FDA roughly 6 months or more to evaluate generic manufacturers to see if they can have medical grade products and then permit them to be sold. So we're anticipating a roughly 6-year period of data exclusivity. Somebody else could do their own data if they wanted to make MDMA into a medicine for PTSD, or they could make MDMA into a medicine for something else. So it's not a monopoly in that same sense, but it is a potential exclusive right for us to market MDMA. And so when I was talking with Bob about the open science statement, I wanted to make sure that the principles that were discussed in this open science statement were consistent with MAPS's strategy and what we're actually going to do. And so what Bob added to the language was that it's okay to use data exclusivity provisions as long as for the public good. So there is this sense in the open science statement that you can have exclusive rights to do things. Now, we could get data exclusivity and decline it and say anybody can start with generic MDMA right off the bat. And those are likely, if there are people like that would likely be doing it for investments, for private gain, which is fine with me. It will eventually happen, but that would take resources from us to use for further research. And so we are not planning to share the data exclusivity. We are going to keep hold of this data exclusivity, but we will make it easy for other people, if they want to make MDMA into a medicine, to use what we've accomplished, that we've put in the public domain, all of our protocols, all of our evaluations of the world's literature on MDMA, that we've spent hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars to create. It's up for free on the website, the protocols. So we're not going to interfere with anybody who wants to make MDMA into a medicine. In fact, we're going to make it easier for them. But at the same time, we're not going to surrender the data exclusivity because we want a source of income, because it is difficult and challenging to constantly be asking people for money. And not only that, the money needs are enormous, because when you think about the numbers of different things that MDMA can be used for, it's MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. You think about what psychotherapy can be for. MDMA can be enhancing almost all of those different things. And each one of those is going to require a phase 3 study, big research to make it legal. And part of the other issues that the open science statement and that we all are concerned about is access. And it's very important that there be insurance coverage for all of this so that people don't have to always self-pay. And insurance will cover things if they're approved by the FDA. But if they're being prescribed off-label, insurance may or may not, and is likely not to approve it and not to pay for it. So I think taking things through the regulatory systems are a way, even if it's by for-profit or nonprofit, it's a way to provide access to people who couldn't otherwise afford it to get it through their insurance. So that's our big plan. And I think what's been of some concern, and I think I'm a little bit, well, I should say I'm less reticent than Bob is about naming names. So we'll talk about a for-profit company who has the patent that Bob read, Compass Pathways in England, and they are definitely operating in a for-profit way. And there's progress that they are making, which is pretty remarkable. And their patent, which Bob read, is running up against all these books. You know, so they're not going to be able to patent any kind of specific use of psilocybin. They are working with people that have been at the forefront of wearable technologies. And so what they're trying to do, I understand, is to make it possible to reduce the cost of this treatment, to use as much technology as possible, to have all these reminders of your depression or your mood tracking. I don't know what they're talking about, but maybe they can end up developing some sort of a therapy that's linked with all this wearable technology that's never been invented before, that's not in these books, and maybe it could even be useful. So they could maybe patent that. But that doesn't mean the core method of what they're doing in terms of using psilocybin for depression will prevent anybody else from doing that. And Bill Richards, who wrote one of these books, who was one of Bob's mentors, is now helping Compass train their therapists. And Roland Griffiths just recently wrote a statement saying that he supports that. He supports Bill Richards helping Compass to develop their therapy training program so that they can deliver the most effective treatments to people. Dave Nickles, who wrote the paper on psilocybin, is also helping Compass. And they're not being rewarded with shares in Compass or anything. They're thinking that this is going to be useful to the whole movement that we're all a part of to try to make these drugs available to more people. So that's my fundamental statement, is that I am supportive, MAPS is supportive of people, anybody who wants to develop psychedelics into medicines, and that we interpret open science to mean exactly that we will share what we've learned on our website and with anybody who wants to use it. That's what open science means to me. We will not be making distinctions between, is this group for-profit, is this group non-profit, is this group people that we like, people that we don't like. I mean, if there's people that we think are doing unethical things, we will be concerned. We can call them out in public. We can do things like that. But our basic position is that the work that we do, paid for by donors, should be in the public domain. I mean, it's being paid for by donors who are getting tax deductions. We have an obligation to make all this public. So that's what we're doing. We don't have any partnerships with Compass. We don't have any stock in Compass. And actually, we're helping USONA, the nonprofit group, even more than Compass, as far as I can tell. So what I'd like to just show you here is what we're doing. Very briefly, this is the results from our phase 2 studies. It's therapy. What we're talking about here is therapy with low-dose MDMA or inactive placebo. And these are chronic treatment-resistant PTSD patients, on average severe to extreme. And when we use our therapy, 23% no longer have PTSD 2 months after the last experimental session, which is really, really good compared to the other therapies. And it's, in some cases, better than the SSRIs. But when we add MDMA, we're up to 56%, more than double. So the MDMA is really adding something fundamental, but it also catalyzes a process that starts this process of healing. So 1 year after the last MDMA session, 2/3 of the people no longer have PTSD, which is pretty incredible. And that's why the FDA has declared it a breakthrough therapy. And so we have raised $26.9 million, all from donations from MAPS, two MAPS, from the psychedelic community, the cryptocurrency, and some right-wing people who care about veterans, particularly Rebecca Mercer. And so while we may not agree with her politics, which I would certainly say I do not, I think that there's an area of shared interest in helping veterans, and we want to take what we're doing out of this bipartisan divisive approach that is ripping America apart, and we want to try to build areas of common agreement and common purpose. And so for me, this acceptance of the donation from Rebecca Mercer was, up till this point, concerning Compass and MAPS, it was the most controversial thing we ever did in our entire history. We got the most criticism for it, but I think, and I'm open to talking about it more, but I think that that was a really good step, and we've created this bipartisan support for what we're doing. We've also gone now to Europe, and we had a meeting June 12th that went really, really well with the European Medicines Agency, their Scientific Advice Working Party. And so we are now doing a fundraise of around $8.5 million we need, of which we already have about 400,000. And these are rough numbers because we haven't completed all of our negotiations with all the countries in Europe, so it probably won't go down, but it might go up. But we're now thinking to move to Europe. So this is the data exclusivity that Ronald Reagan passed. And so here's how we've structured things. Because we want to sell MDMA for a profit, and we want to use those profits for more research, that's something that cannot stay in the nonprofit. It's a taxable situation. So we have created the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation, and that is a for-profit company. And they can sell MDMA, they can sell it for a profit, we will pay taxes on it. And so people make tax-deductible donations to MAPS. MAPS invests in the Public Benefit Corporation. Amy Emerson here leads the Public Benefit Corporation. And then the Public Benefit Corporation can feed the profits back to the missions of MAPS or keep the profits there to do more research. And so this is how we're structured. Now, in California and Delaware, there's now 5,000 or 6,000 of these public benefit corporations. And the basic thing that they do is permit you to maximize public benefit, not profit. So I think one of the flaws of capitalism that you can say is destroying the world is this unbridled focus on maximizing profits above all else. And I think that's what Bob is concerned about with the Openstein statement. You know, you get a patient and you say, oh, you can't pay, you know, kick them out the door, stuff like that. So I think this idea of profit maximization above all else is deadly, and it's destroying the environment, and it's a big problem. And it doesn't mean that all for-profit companies do that, but that's a concern. And so the public benefit corporations have been developed so that you can maximize public benefits, and you need to articulate what those benefits are. Okay, just 1 minute. And then if you incorporate in California, you have to have third-party standards that evaluate you. But there are no third-party standards for pharmaceutical industry. The B Corp has not developed any way to evaluate B Corp and whether, evaluate pharma companies and whether they're operating to maximize public benefit. So MAPS has incorporated the Public Benefit Corporation in Delaware, where you evaluate yourself. And so you could see people, how rigorous is that? So we're working with ethicists at UPenn, Dom Sisti and Jonathan Moreno, who have focused a lot of their work on ethics for pharmaceutical drug development and drug research and things like that. And so they are developing a set of ethical standards that will be quantified, that we will use to score ourselves. And this same standard can be used to score Compass, to score USONA, to score Beckley Foundation, to score Big Pharma, whatever. And so that's going to be our contribution to the ethical standards of how we operate. And so going forward, I think we will just have to be watching how things develop, being mindful of these concerns. And I'll just say that, this is the last thing. That I am supportive of, we signed the Open Science Statement because it describes how MAPS operates. But I do not believe, and my signature of that was not intended to imply that everybody in the whole world should operate by those standards. So that's how I feel consistent with the principles there. We're endorsing them, we believe in them, that's how we're operating, but I don't judge people that want to operate differently. Thank you.
All right, my talk is profits and profits, power and capitalism, and the problems I see emerging from those two things. But before I start, I want to start with something a little bit interactive. So if I could just ask you all a question. How many of you became interested in psychedelics because you thought they might be able to individually and personally help you with some type of a healing, or something that you've experienced, yourself or somebody you care about, some individual healing? So pretty much every hand in the room. And how many of you are also interested?
No, one has the other question.
What's that?
That's the other question. We had other hands go.
I have another question.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't go any figure. I didn't go any figure.
Okay, sure. Thank you. And so the second question is, how many of you are interested in psychedelics because you believe they could heal us culturally and collectively in some way, heal some sickness in society or in culture? So also almost every hand in the room. Okay, those are my only two questions, sorry. But my point is that I would bet that most people come to psychedelics at least in part because they're fed up with the outcomes of capitalism, whether or not they recognize that is the root cause of what they're experiencing. And so that's whether we're talking about the suffering that comes from materialism and the constant pressure to acquire more, be different, have more, whether that's the destruction of the natural environment that we're seeing, whether that's egoism, unnecessary competition, lack of cooperation, excessive productivity demands, the breakdown of communities, mass incarceration, inequality, all these other things, they're all connected to capitalism. None of them are separate from that. And that causes a lot of the individual suffering, or what we perceive to be individual suffering. But we know from feminists decades ago that the personal is political, and so what we experience personally in our suffering is never separate from these bigger structural things. And then I also want to acknowledge, before I go any further, because my topic is limited to capitalism, to quote Bell Hooks here, that we can't speak of capitalism separate from other forms of oppression. That we live in an imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy. And all those things are intertwined and connected. For us to challenge and defeat any one of those, we have to challenge all of them simultaneously and together, because each contains elements of the other. So racism is reinforced by capitalism, and capitalism is reinforced by racism, for example. So I want to start with that framework before I get more specific here. And so I also want to just acknowledge that there are a lot of great critiques of capitalism out there. Marx may still be the most relevant one. I'm not going to touch on that much. But what I do want to give you to take away is a really concise argument that I think any of you can make as to why we need to find ways beyond capitalism in general, and also in relation to psychedelics. The first reference there will be E.F. Schumacher, who wrote a book called Small is Beautiful back in 1973. Where he demonstrated that capitalism is unsustainable on a finite planet because it relies on ever greater consumption of resources that are limited, right? We don't have unlimited oil or water or land or forests. And yet capitalism demands that we increase our spending of these resources every year, and that's because there's a fundamental logical error in capitalism, and that error is that it treats capital as if it's revenue. So capital meaning just an asset, right? Like if you have a job and you have a laptop, your laptop is your capital. You could sell it and act like you just made a profit, but you don't have an unlimited supply of laptops to keep selling and making profits, right? And so that's a fundamental logical fallacy in capitalism. And so as a result of that, the money ends up being seen as a scarce resource, while natural resources end up being treated as if they're infinite, when they're obviously not. The other reference that I'll cite is Thomas Piketty, who wrote a book called Capital in the 21st Century, where he demonstrated over hundreds of years of data all over the world that capitalism will inevitably lead to increasingly large inequality because capital will always grow faster than wages. So meaning if I have $1 million in the bank and I earn 10% return over a year, every year, people can never earn that much on average through their wages. And so it's inevitable that inequality can only get greater under capitalism. And the only exceptions to that are disruptions like wars or Great Depressions or populist uprisings. And so last year, 82% of the global wealth that was generated went to the richest 1%. How much more unequal can we get? I guess it'll keep going until there's another one of those things that redistributes. Yeah. And I advocate for some, not for war, but for populist uprisings for sure. So, capitalism is also a terrible system for social relations. And so some of you may have, I encourage you to look up the whole video of Monkeys Reject Inequality. But this is a monkey who's been given unequal pay, letting the researcher know what he thinks about it. So they set up a token system with monkeys where they could exchange rocks for food. And when you give them a non-preferred food, after they sell you, give the other one the preferred food, they don't like it. So capitalism is unnatural to social relationships. Inequality is unnatural and unhealthy to social relationships, even beyond humans. Works with birds, works with other animals too. I'll also say that there's research from the Commission on Social Determinants of Health, where they said that a systematic review of the research on health impacts. They identified that the maldistribution of power, money, and resources, which are, by the way, the core features of capitalism, are the main drivers of health inequalities in the US and globally. And so tackling these drivers, they further said, requires interventions that focus at the local, national, and global levels. And there's a saying in public health, tell me your zip code and I'll tell you when you're going to die. And it's true. There are, in the city where I'm from, Chicago, the longest living and shortest living neighborhoods that are only a few miles away from each other. There's a 30-year difference in life expectancy, which is as great as between any two countries globally. And that is a direct product of inequality. And I'm a psychologist, so I'm saying this as a psychologist, that I believe that individual healing and enlightenment can only take us so far, and that they cannot touch the root causes of social ills. That we need systemic structural changes to touch that. And this just makes it ironic, all this research, and I think counterproductive to think about delivering healthcare through a capitalist model when capitalism is what's making us sick. It doesn't make sense to me. Yet there appears to be a hope that capitalism can be a Trojan horse for psychedelics to enter the culture. I'm very skeptical of this, and I'm afraid that it's the potential of psychedelics that will be limited and changed. Capitalism, I think, has proven it to be a dominant ideology capable of co-opting and incorporating other ideologies and ideas. Possibly no more strongly than the intersection, this experiment that really took up pace in the 80s of merging capitalism and Christianity. And so you can just look for an example at some of the things that are being done by people who are very devout Christians right now, intentionally traumatizing children by separating from their parents, as one example. And so people will say this is not Christianity, but maybe this is what Christianity is once it's been merged with capitalism, which I think has proven itself to be the more dominant of the two ideologies, which is saying a lot because Christianity's been around and dominated a lot for a long time. And so capitalism, I think, has been able to take on any other ideology, in part because there's not much to it as far as values go. So if you look at a values analysis of capitalism, it values private property, private ownership of property, private wealth, competitive markets, consumption, wage labor, and individualism, and not much else. And so as long as capitalism can still emphasize those things, it can take on whatever other components of values of any other movement. And so I think it's done that with Christianity, and could do it with psychedelics as well. And so there's a parallel here. I think people often draw a comparison between practices like meditation and yoga, and maybe having a slower potential, but a similar potential to what psychedelics have as far as personal transformation. And so if you just look at two very recent studies that have come out on meditation and yoga, There was one study where they found that meditation makes narcissists less empathic, not more. And another that found that meditation and yoga, when taught to people over about 16 weeks, makes people more self-absorbed. So more ego, not less. So, and these were both in Western countries, one in Germany, one in the US. So could that be because these practices have been abstracted as tools, depoliticized, and that capitalism has then narrowed them to be nothing more than just self-improvement strategies designed to reduce stress, help you be more productive in work, and maybe have better abs, right? And so essentially they've been turned into products for many people, and as such, consumption of them just moves one up in the social hierarchy when something's become a product, rather than being so transformational. And so what can we expect from using capitalist models to deliver psychedelics? So here's a good example of co-opting. I don't think this is what Gandhi had in mind, but this is I recently just saw this in Chicago. Be the fascism you want to see in the world, or something, I don't know. And so what will capitalism achieve with psychedelics if we use that as our model for bringing it forth into the culture? I think, yes, you can expect that we'll expand consumption and availability of psychedelics, because that's the one thing it's good at, is promoting consumption, right? But I think we can also expect to see capitalism keep psychedelics within for-profit models where they're inaccessible to those who need them the most, particularly out of the hands of racial and ethnic minorities and people of lower socioeconomic status. I think you can expect capitalism to turn them into another form of self-improvement and therefore move those who consume them up in a social hierarchy. I think you will see a restricted ownership of clinics. It's not just about who owns the drug, and that being held in the hands of a privileged few, as we've seen with marijuana dispensaries in most states. I think you will see a pressure to depoliticize and ignore social justice issues like ending the war on drugs or ending war in favor of narrow medical use, even though at most you all partially are interested in them for the narrow medical use. And I think it's likely to push the focus entirely to the individual level rather than the more revolutionary potential, like social change. And I think each of these things I already see happening to some degree or another. And so that'll bring me into the second part of this, which is guruism, which I'll define for you. So guruism is this might be an image we have of a guru, but it's when we idolize or follow people who are perceived to be experts or masters, often accompanied by an absence of our critical thought, due to the expectation of deference or the assumption that their knowledge is so superior that they're above question to us. And so often when somebody is very charismatic or has some novel ideas or achievements or persistence, we might assume that they have something to offer, and surely they do, because all people do. But we might also have a tendency to see them as superior to ourselves or to other people, even though they might only have their advanced knowledge and ability in a few narrow areas. And so I'm not saying that all gurus are bad people, but and we do have lower standards for gurus in the West, I think. But Elon Musk, that's Elon Musk. So if you don't know who he is, don't find out. So I'm not saying all gurus are bad people, but this arrangement, this power arrangement, this hierarchy arrangement is appealing to narcissists and abusers and will attract them. So that's a systemic problem. But I also think that power imbalance can corrupt people who might not otherwise be problematic. And that's been known very well for a long time, going back to like the Milgram experiment, where you can get people to electrocute somebody if an authority tells them to do so, or the Stanford prison experiment, where if you put somebody in the role of prison guard, they will act like a prison guard. And it's as long as we have these power structures, the power structure is the problem. And as long we can talk about removing the people who climb those power structures, like the Donald Trumps of the world, but there will be a next one. There'll be another one waiting to climb that ladder. The ladder itself is the problem. And so there's also a lot of psychological research that's just interesting, that people under the influence of power and wealth behave almost like they have brain damage in some research. They show less capacity for accurate empathy, less mirror neuron activity in the brain, which we think is very important to compassion, ability to empathize, lower compassion, less generosity with money, and less honesty and ethical behavior, and also more authoritarianism through things like the Stanford prison experiment. And so it's important to remember that gurus and experts, leaders, people that we respect, are still human beings with all the flaws and limitations of other human beings. And so the following of any of them can only go so far, that we can respect and appreciate and build upon their knowledge, but we should not be elevating people, especially elevating them above critique. I think any good leader or guru should recognize that you could be their guru in some ways too. And so we just have an example here. Like if Buddhist gurus can't be trusted to have power, then who the hell can? Like somebody that owns a Fortune 500 company, I don't know. And so ultimately, I would also like to propose that guruism fits well into elitism through it and capitalism through its representation of hierarchy and inequality of power. Specifically, I think gurus meet elite demands for perfection, whether wanting only to be associated with the best designer or best restaurant or biggest house or nicest car or top spiritual leader. And so I learned a great term in preparing this, elite perfectibility. That this becomes kind of like a capitalist version of self-improvement, where you think you're doing a good thing by improving yourself, but are we just forever trying to improve to the point of perfection, which is really about hierarchy? And so what do we do then with how we think about our heroes, our leaders? And so there's an old radical saying that's kill your heroes. Not literally, so don't worry, Rick and Bob. But it means kill them in your own mind, meaning that don't have them in the first place. And if you do have them, recognize that they're just as human as you. They might have advanced knowledge in one or two areas, but you got to go beyond them. And collectively, especially, I think we can go beyond any individual that we would ever elevate to the status of a hero. So coming back to the field of psychedelics, we of course do have researchers and funders and advocates within the psychedelic sphere who have guru-like status, where they're difficult to question. Many have earned a lot of respect through decades of hard work and advocacy, but it's important to remind ourselves that they're human. They have blind spots with things outside their domain. Particularly, I think one of these things is becoming apparent is through systemic understandings of inequality and oppression. That's an area that take some disciplined study, not just enlightenment. And so, as an example of this, I think we could look at the marijuana industry, where there was this blind spot. I think there was a major focus on, and let's just get to the point of medical or decriminalization, legalization, and there wasn't enough thinking about where's this headed and what's next. And so as a result, in many states it's still illegal to grow marijuana. So if you grow it, even though it's legal, you might go to jail. Even more so if you're a person of color, even more so if you're a low-income person of color. In many states, only the rich can own growing and dispensing facilities because you need massive deposits to have the rights to open one of those. And then on top of that, people remain locked in prison for decades for possession of something that's now legal in their state. And these are not just oversights, but injustices due to power, that the people at the top of the hierarchy didn't have the same priorities and perspectives as those lower in the hierarchy. And so the question is it hopeless? Are we powerless? Is there no alternative to the system that's on track to make the Earth uninhabitable potentially by the end of this century? And the answer to me is no. Part of the power of any ideology comes from making you think that ideology is the only one possible. And a great slogan from Occupy, another world is possible. So the power of an ideology is to kill our creativity, our ability to think outside the box. And so if the psychedelic community can't think outside the box, when these substances create openness and creativity, then who the hell are we waiting for to figure out a non-capitalist model in any industry or any field, right? And so I do think we need radical solutions to address systemic problems. Radical not being a scary word, but one that literally means going to the roots. That if you want to solve a problem, do you go to the roots or you satisfy yourself with trimming the leaves? And so I think we can push those who develop psychedelics to resist capitalist models, like establishing nonprofit, co-op business models, and potentially even more importantly, democratizing knowledge of how to use psychedelics safely and effectively. Most psychedelic use will always be outside of medical contexts, I think. And so if we want to kind of do right by the people who are using psychedelics, we need to democratize and put that knowledge out there. And we need to not lose sight of the fact that just because we're fighting this medicalization battle, that we can't let go of the battle against the larger drug war. That those have to go hand in hand, and we have to see ourselves as part of that. And so then, if we reach that point, we can create non-hierarchical, free or cheap, peer-driven mutual aid models. And that needs to be and can be an important check on any for-profit angle that might occur in psychedelic development. And last thing I'll just say is that I'm interested in psychedelics because I think they're important social and cultural medicines. I'm also interested for clients in healing individual traumas, but I'm really excited about them because I think they're important social and cultural medicines that can kind of heal us at that level. And I think when we talk about integrating psychedelics into Western culture in any meaningful way, we're talking about cultural change. And for any project that big, we can't rely on the hierarchies and the people at the top to decide what that's going to look like. It's a discussion that everyone deserves to be involved in. Thank you.
All right, so a couple disclaimers before we get into things. I'm going to be raising a lot of questions that don't necessarily have easy answers, and I'm not raising them to answer them. I'm raising them because I think they're discussions that are happening on the margins, and I'd like to shove those into the spotlight. Additionally, there's going to be some disturbing imagery and language in this presentation, so just a heads up. And I'm going to be making a number of assertions. I have evidence and rational arguments for all of that, but we only have about 20 minutes, so I'll do my best. But feel free to ask me as many questions at the end.
What is the name, and what do you mean by disturbing imagery?
There's going to be some imagery of police brutality, as what some people might term. Sorry. I'll do my best to give a heads up right when we get to that slide. There's a quote from Rick right before we get to it, just so you know. I'm David Nickles. Sorry. I know. So basically, just to kick things off, a few assertions. First is humanity currently faces dire existential threats, most notably in the form of nuclear proliferation and climate change. These are being rapidly accelerated under the Republican Party, but proliferation was definitely going on under Obama. Number two, slavery and genocide were foundational to the US and American capitalism, and those legacies are alive and well. The US is a waning hegemonic power, and it's still clinging to the grand area that was carved out after World War II. If you're wondering why this is relevant, it has to do directly with where we're deploying troops, and if we're going to be talking about treating veterans for PTSD, I think we have to understand the systems of why they are where they are in the world. Additionally, industrial civilization is unsustainable and the main cause of ecocide, which is to say that the Earth is not dying, it's being killed, and those who are killing it have names and addresses. The same goes for social safety nets. And ultimately, psychedelics only matter in a human context, which is to say, when we talk about the benefits of psychedelics, we're talking about the benefits to us, to our friends, to our family, to society at large. If society isn't around, there's no benefits. So let's take a brief look at why drugs are illegal. We can trace this back to white supremacy and the notions that, cocaine-crazed Negroes required higher caliber bullets and multiple rounds to stop them from raping white women. We can talk about imperialism and the statements by folks like John Ehrlichman, who publicly acknowledged that it was not possible to criminalize being against the war or being black, but they very well could criminalize the compounds that these groups were using and use those as a pretext to go after the groups themselves. Additionally, if we look at this quote by Nixon, homosexuality, dope, immorality in general are the enemies of strong societies, we can see what's being presented as vice. So the notion that homosexuality is vice ties misogyny with drugs and criminalization. And I'm hardly the first pundit to comment that psychedelics aren't good for the production of widgets. And we can talk more about microdosing later, but I would suggest that that's playing a role in what we're seeing as far as this mainstreaming. Now, to take a moment and look at dominant culture and the state, and when I say dominant culture, I mean systems of white supremacy, capitalism, patriarchy, the industrial civilization, things that we find ourselves ground under the heel of on a daily basis. They're predicated on coercion and violence, which is to say social peace is an illusion. Every law in this society is enforced down the barrel of a gun. If you break the law, the expectation is that the cops will show up armed, granted the ability to use lethal force. If you're black or brown, you probably know that significantly better than many other people in society. And there's also the ability for them to lock you in a cage. Now, I would contend that authority is not self-justifying. That means if somebody's going to tell you you can't do something, or if something is a certain way, they better be able to back that up with actual evidence and reasons. As such, it bears noting that psychedelics weren't criminalized by accident, but for political reasons, and that there was no evidence with which to make claims about their dangers to individuals or society. And as such, psychedelics belong in the public domain. Medical, spiritual, intellectual, and recreational applications are all equally legitimate. This brings us to some issues with the medical model. First, the legitimacy of the medical model is predicated on prohibitionist dynamics. That is to say, there was no rationale for criminalizing these things in the first place, so when the medical community says, hey, we recognize that these are very dangerous, but trust us, we're professionals, we have the ability to work with these things safely, they've already accepted that the state's argument is valid when we all know that it's not. Second, when we look at, it blows me away that there are so many incredibly talented and well-trained professionals who talk about psychedelics being profound medicines because they approach cures, right? We're looking at single or very few interventions to see tremendous results. But then when we see how these are being applied on a systemic level, we're treating individuals and then putting them back into these profoundly sick systems. And so what we see is, on the macro level, systemic symptom management rather than striving for any sort of cultural cure. And I've seen a number of professionals outright dismiss that that's even a possibility. Additionally, there's been a lot of claims about, professional medicine being capable of taking on the burdens and the risk. But if we look historically, and even if we just limit it to a US context, we can see that medicine is and was racist and classist. We can look at folks like Henrietta Lacks, who had their biological property stolen. We can look at the experiments that were done on the Tuskegee Airmen. This isn't like a radical notion that there are problems with medicine. And additionally, Nick Sand stated, psychedelics are not solely about curing ill people, but about making well people weller. And my concern is that the medical model will ultimately subvert and push all these other options to the side in its focus to race towards legalization or medicalization, as is perhaps more accurate. So there's been a lot of talk about mainstreaming, and it seems important to sort of break down what mainstreaming is. Now, personally, I would contend that mainstreaming is a project of respectability politics, wherein we're expected to show that our values are continuous with those of dominant culture. So that would mean that we're showing that our values are continuous with things like white supremacy, capitalism, patriarchy, and I would contend that that ultimately results in the whitewashing or homogenization of marginalized perspectives, right? Those of us who are ethnic minorities, those of us who are racial minorities, those of us who are maybe gender nonconformist or radicals, find ourselves in a position where our values are fundamentally at odds with those of dominant culture. So we can already anticipate that there's no space for us in mainstreaming, because there's no space for us in the mainstream in the first place. Additionally, as Geoff pointed out wonderfully, the way that things exist in the mainstream is as commodities. They're commercialized, they're bought and sold. Any value that they have intrinsically to themselves and to us is removed and instead placed in the context of the market to be bought and sold and stripped of that potential additional value. And we also see the flattening and commodification of culture. This is true not only when people make statements about what the indigenous would do or say as, monolithic groups, but as somebody who's spent quite a bit of time working on underground psychedelic research, publishing phytochemical breakdowns of all sorts, I've always bristled when a certain organization sends out funding requests under the notion of support psychedelic science. Because to me, it seems like there's so many more interesting ways that we can support psychedelic science than just giving money. I think we all have things that we can contribute to these fields, and I think emphasizing that diversity rather than flattening it is really important. So obviously it's apparent that I think the mainstream is a mistake. And the main reason is that, as I've said, dominant culture is literally presenting an existential threat to human life on this planet. And if we don't exist, psychedelics really don't matter. And for people who are pushing mainstreaming, I would suggest that, as with any assertion you make, that the burden of evidence is on you. So where's the historical or peer-reviewed evidence that mainstreaming has ever worked? And if we don't have evidence, then I think we can say that it's meaningless propaganda, which takes us to this notion of support the troops. The point of public relations slogans like support our troops is that they don't mean anything. That's the whole point of good propaganda. You want to create a slogan that nobody's going to be against and everybody's going to be for. Nobody knows what it means because it doesn't mean anything. Its crucial value is that it diverts your attention from a question that does mean something. Do you support our policy? That's the one you're not allowed to talk about. So similarly to Rick, I don't have a problem naming names. There's a company named Compass that has stepped into this arena. They're a venture capitalist-backed endeavor that's looking to engage in a vertically integrated model of psilocybin therapy for depression. So if we take a moment and look at how for-profit works, it seems worth noting they put money over everything. They're essentially venture capitalists who invest in this company, and they have a requirement for a return on their investment. That's why they're giving you money in the first place. They're expecting money back. So if they're expecting money back, that means they need an exit strategy, right? They need to get their money out of that investment. Exit strategies generally look like initial public offerings, or in this case, a big pharma buyout. Now, a big pharma buyout means any of the intellectual property, including exclusivity agreements and junk patents that people may say don't have much value other than to restrict access for others, become the property of that big pharma company. Now, I think everybody in this room knows how big pharma companies wield those powers, and the notion that that wouldn't create restrictions for other people, to me, seems a little absurd. Additionally, if we take a moment and look at this model of vertical integration, right, basically this means that they're looking to control the supply chain from synthesis through therapy. And that ultimately gives them a lockdown where they can deny access to other folks really by any means possible. If they control all aspects of that supply chain, there's very little room for other people to get involved. That also means that they can utilize value-based pricing to maximize profits. And what value-based pricing would look like is, let's say, cost to an insurer for traditional therapy for depression costs $10,000 a year. Now, let's say you can afford to sell psilocybin therapy for $2,000 a year, but you recognize that you could offer it to the insurance company for $8,000 a year, because they're still going to save $2,000 at the end, and you're going to put a lot more money in your pocket. But the thing is, we're the people that pay insurance premiums, and it seems pretty simple to suggest that a premium for a $2,000 per year therapy is going to be a hell of a lot lower than $8,000 per year. So when we look at what the results of vertical integration are, we see that it's the monopolization of markets, it's the manipulation of prices, it's the privatization of benefits, and it's the socialization of cost. And as Geoff pointed out, that's not unique. That's how capitalism works. Additionally, if we look at some of the characters involved in Compass, we can see that there's an empowerment of authoritarians and surveillance apparatus. And so let's look at Peter Thiel, right? Not only did he provide the funds for Hulk Hogan to shut down Gawker, but he created Palantir. If you're not familiar with Palantir, it is perhaps the most insidious surveillance apparatus that exists to date, which I would suggest is significant if there's a lot of people in this room who may be part of criminal subcultures. Now, Palantir was funded by the CIA venture capitalist fund in QTEL. I actually didn't know they had a venture capitalist fund until I started digging around in this. And that Palantir is actually used by ICE for mass deportations and rounding up of immigrants, as well as other law enforcement officers to come after people who may be in criminalized subcultures. So the notion that organizations that are maybe advocating for criminalized subcultures climbing into bed with Peter Thiel doesn't make much sense to me. Now, additionally, in a speech given to the Cato Institute in 2009, Thiel stated, "The vast increase in welfare beneficiaries and the extension of the franchise to women have rendered the notion of capitalist democracy into an oxymoron." Additionally, in that same talk, he stated, "The 1920s were the last decade in American history during which one could be genuinely optimistic about politics." Now, if you know anything about the 1920s, it's the last time social and wealth inequity in this country remotely approached the absurd state that we're in today. So I think this gives a pretty clear vision of what Thiel imagines. Now, if we understand the economic drivers of military enlistment, right? If we understand that with a high school diploma or GED, you can earn significantly more money in the military, that you've got things like the PX and commissary that offer cheaper goods without being taxed. I mean, I had an ex-partner I was with for a long time who was in a military family, and the amount of financial benefits you get are incredible. We're seeing the social safety nets shredded before our eyes. TRICARE provides such incredible insurance compared to what's available through Obamacare or the private market. It's pretty simple to argue that Peter Thiel's societal vision is fundamentally at odds with Matt's stated goal of treating and minimizing trauma to the troops. So I would say it has to be one or the other. Additionally, if we look at some of the broader systemic issues, we can see that mainstreaming has the potential to reinforce industrial civilization. So like I said, microdosing being used largely in Silicon Valley and elsewhere, the notion that using small amounts of LSD will make your programmers more competent. I would suggest that it's telling that LSD has begun to become accepted in society at the point where it no longer presents the threat of massive boundary dissolution and the potential for reorganizing society, but rather the reinforcement of wage labor and systems that keep us isolated and alienated from each other. And additionally, when folks like Aubrey Marcus make statements about how if we all just drank Wachuma and came down to the jungle together, we could possibly overcome our humanitarian challenges, you know, I would suggest that people who are in that unique situation of owning the means of production might turn the means of production over to their workers as a way of actually making material benefits in the world, rather than talking about how we can all come together in these fantastic situations. Additionally, if we look at a recent study, it's done specifically on psychedelic medicine studies, it pointed out that 82.3% of participants were non-Hispanic white, and concluded that minorities are greatly underrepresented in psychedelic medicine studies. It went on to point out that as a result, many of the findings may not generalize to marginalized communities. Additionally, we can see these issues at play in the characterization of indigenous and things that go on within shamanic and drug tourism contexts. And Rick's quote of, how do we reach out to police groups because they have more trauma, I would suggest the verb is a little misplaced. They cause more trauma. So, you know, I think as with cannabis, as with normal making statements about it doesn't matter why Boehner is now in support of legal cannabis, while tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of folks are still locked down for basic drug crimes, to me, it's putting the cart before the horse. It's focusing on the wrong populations. It's not looking at the actual effects of systemic violence. And so when we take a look at what mainstreaming looks like, we can also see that there's a lot of utilization of power to reinforce misogyny and patriarchy. And the words that I'd like to share are not my own. They were published publicly, and I would ask that you all take about 30 seconds to read them to yourself. So with that being said, I have a couple questions for Maps. Where do you draw the line? Is it if Compass signs exclusivity contracts with suppliers? Is it if Compass plans to subvert the regulators? Is it if one donor threatens to pull $500,000? What about 2? What about 5? Is it if the business models inherently deny access to others? Is it if you must collaborate with fascists and misogynists? Is it if your work requires legitimizing without critiquing murderous and traumatizing institutions and systems such as the Department of Defense or the Department of Health and Human Services? And is it if you're in breach of the Statement of Open Science? Thank you.
I would like to invite the panelists to sit on the I don't know the word. Stage. Yeah, who
We
has
need
the
another
mic?
mic up front, please. Who has the mics?
Oh, can you bring it here to me, please? You can just.
Wow. I just needed a second to recover myself. That was fantastic. Very intense. I hope you guys are all feeling it. Thank I want to thank all of you for coming up here and being a part of this. This is amazing. And everyone in the audience, I'm hoping you were taking notes and getting some questions down because we'd love to start a conversation here. So yeah, who would like to start? My goal is to have 3 questions be presented to all of us, and then we'll give the panelists a chance to sort of select which question they would like to delve into. That we have more of a discussion and less of this back and forth, so we have more of a dialogue going. So yeah, feel free to raise a hand and we'll come around.
Hi, I just want to make a small reminder that we're using the hashtag.
Bia, if you move in front of the speaker.
Okay, sorry. We're using the hashtag POLIPSY, POLIPSY18 to Facebook and Twitter. And I also, since we're talking about capitalism, I just want to take a note to thank all the speakers that all of them came self-funded. We didn't give them any hotel or any transportation or any food at all, except some bagels and some coffee. So I do want to acknowledge the great efforts, especially for those who come out of town, to fund your entire trip. And there's different ways to put together a conference. One is to spend a few years fundraising and trying to do the same that Rick has done to other people, go to Rick and to others and ask for money. And the other way is to charge tickets. So we have, challenges in organizing conferences, and I appreciate very much the goodwill of the speakers, and I wanted to acknowledge that. Also wanted to acknowledge that those women out there, they're criticizing us for the lack of women. I'm saying, don't have illusions. They're all men there, but we are in charge, in fact, okay? Okay. Katie, who are you going to take questions from?
Yeah, who are we going to take questions from? I don't see a single hand up yet. Oh, I suppose I should have a mobile mic now, shouldn't I?
Okay, I'm taking it.
Thank you.
Can you come here?
Yeah.
For better. No, I'll hold it here. It's okay.
Over there?
Yeah, you hold that mic, okay? Yeah. Say your name. I'll hold it for you.
My name is Alicia Danforth, and I came prepared with a question. Back in 2011, I had an unnerving 1 degree of separation encounter with Peter Thiel related to my dissertation work. And when I saw it announced that he was on the board for Compass, I started doing a lot of homework. And it was very easy to find articles that demonized him, but I was looking for a balanced account. So I read an article. This article appeared in The Hill online entitled The Demonization of Peter Thiel by Robert Goldberg in December of 2016. And my question for the panel, I'm truly trying to get a sense of what my community in the broadest sense believes. And Goldberg wrote, "The hysterical reaction to Peter Thiel reflects the belief that commercialization of medical science is a source of social injustice." And I'm trying to figure that out. And I wonder to what extent the panelists agree or disagree with that statement. Should I read just that part again? Goldberg writes, "The hysterical reaction to Peter Thiel reflects the belief that commercialization of medical science is a source of social injustice." Discuss.
3 questions.
Yes, please.
Can you come here, please, and say your name and just, your name and your question.
Sorry. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eugene Kanatal, and my question is for Geoff. I was just wondering if you could expound upon what you were saying about yoga, meditation, leading to like less empathy for folks. So that was just something that stuck with me from your talk, and I just was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that. Thank you.
And another.
Oh, I didn't see.
Hands way in the back in the hat.
Here, come here.
Let's take 5. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm Kellen Thomas. I had a question about, I appreciate the efforts to hire a patent attorney to figure out how to protect against the use of patents for psychedelic medicines. But one of my sort of greatest fears is the new legislation in 2007 about the risk evaluation and mitigation strategy, which is another regulatory mechanism that I think could be subverted. I was wondering if you could address how you thought we could prevent the subversion of that regulatory mechanism for trying to control the supply chain. Thanks.
I'm Joanna Steinhardt. I'm curious about, this is for Rick, but also for all of you. If you met with Rebecca Mercer and talked to her, I'm curious what her motivation is, or what her stated motivation was in the donation. And then for all of you, if you've thought about this overlap, because the way I saw it was that her family is libertarian, and libertarians generally support drug legalization as well as being rabid capitalists. But so that there might be an overlap there in the legalization of some of these substances as well, even though that would go against the market logic of making a lot of money from their patenting. But anyway, because we can grow our own mushrooms, sort of where I'm coming from.
Yeah, we're just taking, opportunity to hear the public, make the best out of our time.
And if we have time, I do have some questions fielded from our online community. If I could pose that, I'd like to as well.
Cool, thanks. My name is Dave McGahey. I'm curious if the panel feels that the for-profit that's coming is inevitability, and if it's not, why? And if it is, what is the best version you would want to see?
And the final comments coming from our online community of psychedelic enthusiasts and advocates would be in regards to biopiracy. Can you hear me this way? God, it's so awful, I apologize. So talking about biopiracy, and then also talking about how the medicalization of psychedelics actually ends the war on drugs, or helps to contribute to the war on drugs, and maybe instead actually sustains it.
We're going to take the answers in the same order, if you don't mind. So Bob, Rick, Jeff, and Dave, okay?
Want somebody to repeat the questions?
Well, no. You just comment whatever you feel, you want to comment.
I'd like to comment on this. Good?
Maybe you do
Not
the
quite.
handheld mic. It was a lot louder. Yeah.
It's easier, thank you. Ooh, that's a lot louder. I would like to comment on the question of the role of, quote, for-profit, and start by saying that I'm not sure that for-profit versus non-profit is actually the most helpful distinction to focus on. The reason, as I alluded to earlier, is that every physician, psychotherapist, lawyer for that matter, in private practice, and we can call it a professional practice with professional standards, reports their income over expenses in a way that the IRS defines it as profit. Schedule C is a report of profit and loss from business. So profit's not intrinsically a bad thing. In this particular world, we seem to need money to survive. If you live in India, maybe you can live without money. It doesn't get very cold there. Places where it gets cold, we need shelter. If there's a group practice where a number of caregivers share a front office and a back office, there's now a group profit, which is probably a good thing. The decision makers are local. They're answerable to the community they're in. They have contact with the people they serve. So profit is not necessarily a bad thing. If I try to imagine what would be the benefit of delivering psychedelic-assisted therapy in a scaled profit model? I have to stretch a little bit, but the fact of the matter is Starbucks serves a pretty consistently good cup of coffee pretty much anywhere in the world. So the brand is worth something. There is quality control. There's consistency in the product. There's profit. But consumers also have a lot of choice. What would a psychedelic therapy chain look like? Well, hopefully it wouldn't be at all exclusive. And let me give you an illustration of what I mean by that. Let's suppose you go to a cardiologist who says, sorry to tell you, you've got a little problem there. But don't worry, there's a fairly simple surgical intervention that's quite likely to correct it. And then the cardiologist goes on to say, but I also have to tell you there's apparently a newer, somewhat more effective, somewhat safer version of that procedure. But the doctor across town who developed it won't tell the rest of us how he does it. So I think you probably want to go to the other cardiologist. How sad would that be? Where doctors don't help each other, where they don't share their best tools and their discoveries and their brand new discoveries with the medical profession. An even worse outcome would be if your cardiologist doesn't know about the new procedure or knows about it and just doesn't tell you, because then you'll leave his or her practice. So we need to think of what a chain would look like that isn't subject to those kinds of shortcomings. I'm not quite sure what the economy of scale would be, but there might be one. Maybe you could buy really nice audio equipment in bulk. Maybe you could share designs for a session room. Maybe you have a combination of treatment modalities which you're willing to share with the rest of the profession, but you deliver that combination really well. Maybe you have beautiful locations, maybe extraordinary food. There are lots of ways to compete that don't involve impeding or shutting out or erecting barriers. So we may see the development of, we'll say, branded psychedelic therapy. And I'm not convinced it's a bad thing, as long as there's a lot of freedom for everyone else to play and to have free access to even the newly discovered tools and technologies.
All right, well, I'll try to answer all the questions very quickly, but I will say that I'm particularly curious about the dangers of meditation. So I'll start with Peter Thiel. I think that we need to look at the actions of Compass, not at the ethics of their investors. And I think the same is true. We have taken money from Rebecca Mercer. We've taken money from libertarians. We've taken money from Republicans. We've taken money from venture capitalists. Taken means received in donations. And so I really think that that's not a logical way to think about these things. We can demonize particular investors or donors, but we need to look at the actions of the companies. And as I don't think Peter Thiel is spending 1 second thinking about how Compass actually works. And I don't think they're trying to influence them. So I think that kind of argument to demonize the donors or investors doesn't really get us very far. I think this question about the REMS was really good, the risk evaluation and mitigation strategies. And so what these are mechanisms by the FDA to control risks. Certain drugs have certain specific risks that other drugs don't, and so they've now got regulatory authority to provide certain kind of controls over how these drugs are used medically. And where we are negotiating the REMS with the FDA, with the DEA, and we will again with the European Medicines Agency, the main two things that we're going to be requiring in harmony with these organizations is that unlike most drugs that are approved as medicines, where then any physician can prescribe them, either for what they're approved for or for off-label uses, we are going to require that only those people that have been trained by us in our method or trained by other companies that are using our method and training people in that will be able to prescribe and treat people with MDMA. So what the FDA is looking at is that the drug therapy combination was what was proven together. It's not that MDMA or psilocybin will be approved out of context in the way in which it's administered. So the people that administered it need to understand what that context is and be trained in it. So I feel quite comfortable that that's a good way, because we don't want to start rolling these things out and have people who are not well trained, who are taking risky situations and not having good outcomes. The other thing that we're going to require with the REMS is that it's only administered under supervision, that these are not take-home drugs. So that's the essence of the REMS, and I don't think it's a bad thing. I think these are ways to control the rollout of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy to try to make it so that the benefits outweigh the risks and there's not a backlash against it. I think this question about how we think about like the motivations of Rebecca Mercer. Rebecca Mercer she restricted her donation to us, and it's restricted only for veterans. So her concerns is veterans with PTSD. What I find very interesting is that the main people who have been trying to control what MAPS does, is David Nickles, is people who are telling us, don't help Compass, don't do this, don't do that. Don't take the money from Rebecca Mercer, don't do this or that. Rebecca Mercer herself has only said it has to be for veterans. So I think that what's happening, from what I understand, is the donation that she gave to us came out within several days of an op-ed that she wrote in the Wall Street Journal, where she tried to say that she felt that she was being unfairly attacked in the media, and that she was actually very progressive in all these different ways, and she was pro-immigrants and all this and stuff. And you read this and it sounds great, and then they've got this little part where she says, but I'm still pro-Trump. So you kind of wonder, how did these things all go together? But at the same time, I think her motivation was to be involved in helping veterans and also trying to show that she could be progressive in certain ways. And she was introduced to me by a left-wing founder of a human rights organization. So it wasn't through right-wing military circles, it was through a human rights activist. I think this question about biopiracy, biopiracy. Sometimes I am so grateful that MDMA came from a lab. It eliminates all sorts of stuff about, did we snatch it out of a cultural context? It's out of the modern Western scientific context invented by Merck in 1912. And so I think we're fortunate in that regard, and that we can sort of develop our own models for it without people saying that we're culturally appropriating something from somebody else. I think the essence, though, to get back to this final thing, which Bob was talking about, is the for-profit, non-profit, or the patenting or non-patenting aspect of it. And so from that, what I will say is that that development is not only inevitable, but it is necessary. Because we, as limited nonprofits, MAPS, USONA, Hefter, Beckley, there are hundreds and hundreds of millions of people, 300 million people with depression, 100 million people with treatment-resistant depression. There's 8 million people in the US with treatment-resistant PTSD. I do not think that we have the capacity to deliver the healing to all the people that need it from within a nonprofit context. I do think that the for-profit context needs to be operating under an ethical set of standards, and we will try to develop those and share those with others, and we can evaluate how people act. But I don't think that we should see the development of for-profit companies as a problem. We should see it as a sign of our success, that we have eliminated, after 30 years or so of work, MAPS is now 32 years old, we've eliminated, along with Hefter, along with other groups, the political obstructions for this research, which can now take place. So now for-profit people can think, aha, it's about doing the science, it's about getting the approvals, it's about treating patients. They don't have to factor in all of these other uncertainties for political repression. So I welcome the entrance of for-profit people. I also welcome the fact that, as Bob showed in all those books, that there's so much of this that is already in the public domain that I am not scared, nor do I believe that USONA, Bill Linton is not the one that's criticizing Compass. The people that work for Bill Linton, Roland Griffiths is sympathetic with Bill Richards working for Compass. That I don't think that the USONA people feel that they are going to be unable to find a synthetic route to psilocybin. nor will they be unable to do their phase 3 research. So I think that this patenting part, we want, if somebody could figure out a new way to make MDMA effective in 1 dose instead of 3 doses, we should let them do it. Let them, if they can patent, if somebody can invent some kind of MDMA that's with, okay, if somebody can invent a better version of MDMA, let them patent it.
So maybe a place to start extending on that would be to Alicia's question about is it hysterical to think that profit motive in healthcare inherently leads to injustice? And I don't think it is at all. I think there are fundamental differences between a for-profit versus a universal system. So I also agree that the for-profit nonprofit is not the most helpful distinction, because the NFL was a nonprofit. So you can do all kinds of unethical things in a nonprofit structure. So it's more so for-profit, I think, versus things that are in the common domain or that are more universally available. But there are fundamental differences between those systems. So if you're in the United States and you're poor and you are concerned about you have cancer diagnosis and you're looking for the best cancer treatment, people who have much less severe forms of cancer can jump the line on you because they can pay more. Versus in a universalist system, it's based on need, and so when people complain about having to wait in line in universal healthcare systems, I think it's usually like somebody with a bad knee and a lot of money to spend who doesn't like waiting behind the guy with cancer who doesn't have much money to spend. So that to me is an inherent injustice. And if I could just give a personal example there, my mom died 3 years ago at age 67. And I have to think that in part our healthcare system had something to do with that, partly because 2 years before her death, my parents had gone 3 years without health insurance, which isn't great for your health when you're in your mid-60s. And then she had it for 2 years, but had some health problems that developed during that time that ultimately killed her. So that to me is an injustice, and that's coming from the family where my father at least went to college, where we kind of had enough. Like the further you go down on the socioeconomic scale, and if you're a person of color, the more likely those things are to happen. So I do think there are inherent injustices there. I'm also one who was opposed to the Mercer donation. Paulo Freire had a word for those kind of donations. He called it false charity. That's where you, with one hand, benefit from systemic inequality, and from the other hand, get to monopolize the altruism by giving a little bit of it back. With strings attached, oftentimes. I'm not saying that was, but oftentimes that is the case. And then the last point I think was about the meditation research, which I don't mind saying a little bit more about that. But a few years ago, I've been kind of uncritical of meditation, viewed it as pretty neutral, pretty much beneficial to anyone. I was at a diversity conference for therapists in different fields, and went to a panel discussion on cultural issues in mindfulness meditation, which was a question I hadn't thought about much, so I attended it. In that panel, they talked about things that they had seen, like with mindfulness meditation being taught in public schools, for example, where it didn't sound a whole lot different than how a psychiatric medication might be used in a public school to silence somebody, to redirect their suffering inward and not act it out and express it. And so I think you can very much, meditation is pretty much a neutral tool when you abstract it from its context in Buddhism or whatever system of meditation you're using. And so I think particularly when you get too behavioral with it and you're just trying to use it for instrumental purposes, for some behavior, some narrow focus, it has the potential to be used in oppressive ways. So telling that kid who's acting out based on some traumatic history they've had and not having enough attention in the school because it's understaffed and whatever all the systemic things are, now they're acting out here in school, to tell them to kind of put them in a timeout with meditation, I think can be oppressive. Rather than helping them find other ways to take action against these things that are negatively impacting them. Am I out of time? Yes. Okay. So anyways, those research studies were in a Western context, and so might be something to do with the nature of capitalism. I suspect that can make meditation not be beneficial in some cases.
So I think the medical question is dismissed in one simple case. There are people in this country dying because they can't afford insulin. And they've tried to get it crowdfunded, and they failed, and they died. And you can Google that, and it's just true. I take a lot of issue with Rick talking about what Bill Linton and USONA are and are not cool with. They're not here to talk about what they are and are not cool with. There's the issue that Compass has signed an exclusivity deal with Onyx, right? Like there are actual market restrictions that they're engaged in, and you're supporting that, and you're well aware of it, and you're not sharing that, right? Like you're pretending like that's not the case. Additionally, if you look into Tapestry Networks, which was started by George Goldsmith, right? They exist as a regulatory capture agency. They literally traffic in regulatory capture. Now, that means that they're set up to run the regulators. That's problematic. I assume nobody here knows of 7 Cups. 7 Cups is one of the wonderful partnerships that Compass has that they're using to train their therapists with bots to engage in active listening. As far as the Rebecca Mercer stuff, I think it was disingenuous that it was presented as $1 million donation. It's $250,000 over 4 years. That money could have easily been made up over, well, and if we compare that with the Pineapple Fund, right, there was explicit statement about how much money was being raised over what period of time. Given the expertise of some of the folks making these statements, it's hard to not see that as misleading. Calling accurate statements about things that Peter Thiel has said and expressed as his visions for society as demonization, like that's literally killing us. Like I have friends, I have family who are dying as a result of these policies. And for you to present that as demonization is patently untrue. The Wall Street Journal article was PR. Rebecca Mercer has been referred to as the most powerful woman in the Republican Party. Noam Chomsky has accurately labeled the Republican Party as presenting the greatest threat to humanity. When certain people call these folks fascists, it's not a smear. It's literally, they are textbook fascists. They are merging industry and state. They are shutting down free press. They are engaged in activities that put us all at risk. When we find ourselves in the streets with folks who are tapping into histories of genocide, of like actual assault on our communities, it's not inappropriate to push them out of those spaces. And I would say so too with Compass. The biopiracy issue is coming up likely because I called out Chris Killam and Zoe Helene and Cosmic Sister for engaging in what I would consider to be neocolonialist and paternalist treatments of indigenous folks. Chris Killam is literally on the record saying Pure World's patent of maca is okay because they're granting the indigenous the rights to use their traditional plants, as though they have that permit, as though they should have that power in the first place. It's laughable. If you go on my Facebook and you look at the things that Chris posted in defense of that, like seriously, just take a look. Bob, I do take a bit of an issue with the for-profit Starbucks model. If we look at what's going on the production end, it's pretty horrific. You kind of acknowledged it with the cell phones too. I hear you as far as, like, I blow glass. I blow glass so that I don't have to monetize my psychedelic commentaries. That's a choice that I've made, and my glass blowing is tied to extractive industry, right? I cannot blow glass in a non-industrial context, and it comes with certain costs. That said, I think just because we recognize on the individual level that there is something to be said for profit doesn't mean we can't push towards systems that move away from that. And just as a final word, just look into the MAPS B Corp, look into the partnerships with DOD, DHHS. Kevin Balktick is here, like we have major issues as far as sexual assault and misogyny stuff being covered up, and I think Neil Goldsmith was on the MAPS integration list until like a week or two ago. Like according to Kevin's statement, there was damning evidence that he had engaged in fundamentally inappropriate behavior. So why the hell is MAPS sending people who are looking for help integrating to him? Thank you.
All right, guys, how about 2 more questions, if that inspired you at all? We're going to take 2 more questions from the audience. 2 more questions from the audience. Am I yelling in this thing yet? No more questions from the audience, really? Oh, there's one.
Here, you can come here, please. You want to make a question? Huh? Okay, you can come here too. After her. Just a brief question. Your name? No.
Oh, I'm Kat Konauer. A question for you, Rick, but starting first with thank you for your strategic vision and dedication lifelong that has brought us, along with a lot of other people, to this day. Tons and tons. And I'm also wondering why you think MAPS is best poised to be the organization to deliver us into this next phase by having exclusive rights on who gets trained and then who delivers, particularly based on some of these things coming to light. But not just that, also statistics on the fact that those being... Sorry, I'm going too long, huh? Sorry. Yeah, I'll stop. No, it's good.
We're all under a lot of emotions, and you know.
I'm done. I think there's enough there. Okay. Thanks, Bia.
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, my name is Jiro. Hi, Jiro, and yeah, and I really appreciate all people come and be together, and I like the temperature. And I see a special arm movement reached out. I see a personal different energy by facial expression, but probably this high temperature cooking is, if we do now, I think it's beneficial for all of us. Thank you.
Last chance. Last question here, a comment, and then we're going to have everybody, in the same order. They can have a final comment about the questions or what the other panelists said. So just hold on tight. Last person that want to come up, in our infamous panel about capitalism in its very few last moments.
Thank you. This question has to do with the difference between microdosing and taking doses where you are not sure you ever even existed or were born, and the relative advantages to that. And it touches on there was a man who used to have a lot to do with psychedelics, and he talked about becoming a person of knowledge. And the key of that was being able to go between the worlds, so that you could face an angel in one room and turn around and face the devil in the next room, and it was all the same. And you could hold them both with love, because that's what the world was created of. So I'm interested in your perspectives on that, given our pressure cooker. Thank you.
Just for you to know, it's 3:30, so officially we're done. But we're gonna have, a little extra 5 minutes, and then it's the break. So please be concise. Starting with Bob. You don't have. No, you can say it's 2 words. Just a final comment.
Okay, I'll do the final comment. Thank you for the question, but I wanted to save a minute for something else. Lest anyone walk away with an incorrect notion, I don't actually like the Starbucks model for the delivery of profound psychedelic experience. It came up because somebody up here, Rick, asked me, could I possibly envision a non-unethical, for-profit model for psychedelic therapy delivery? So I took the challenge. I think you can probably do it, but you need to put in a lot of checks and balances. Do I like it? Around capitalism in particular, and please understand capitalism is different from for-profit. Capitalism needs to be profitable, but there can be profit outside of a capitalist structure. Beware the nature of the beast. Are you familiar with this story where a person encounters a snake and it looks like maybe they can be friends, but the person's afraid of getting bitten, and the snake says, "Oh, don't worry, we'll just be friends. I wouldn't bite you." They become friends. The snake bites the person and says, "What's up with that? Ouch, I'm going to die." "Well, you knew I was a snake." Okay, I think we need to be very careful of what capitalists and capital-driven structures will do to stay alive. They have a lot of tools at their disposal. Regulatory capture was mentioned. It's not just patents. There's the whole world of commercial contracts, of being first movers, of having very keen marketing departments that will build your brand. There's a whole wonderful, awful toolkit available. And I have to believe, as a starting assumption, that if there is a venture capital-backed entity coming into the psychedelic space, that they will use all of those available tools unless they promise not to. And so far, guess what? None of the two venture-backed organizations that I'm aware of have agreed to promise not to. So make of that what you will. If the snake bites, you knew what it was.
Well, let me start out with the angel and the devil in different rooms and holding them all with love. I think we need to think about that in terms of Peter Thiel and Rebecca Mercer. That these are dialogues that we're developing with people who have been demonized, rightly so, for certain things that they do. But I think we need to recognize that they're learning about psychedelic therapy. They're learning about spirituality to some extent. So it's not like these are fundamentally evil people. We should shun them completely. We have to look at, what strings are attached, if any. But I think that that idea of holding with love those who are on other sides of political divides is really important. And I think we need to build bridges. I don't think we should be burning bridges. I think we should be building bridges. As far as this question about the REMS and MAPS being the only organization that can train these therapists, the reason is a regulatory reason. The reason is that we have developed this method. We have not patented this method. We have put this method called inner-directed therapy up on the website. Anybody could read it. Anybody can see our therapeutic approach. But it's the therapeutic approach that's being used in the clinical studies, and the FDA wants people who will be able to prescribe this to know the therapeutic approach that we have developed. It's from Stan Groff. It's from Bill Richards. It talks about the inner healer, the inner healing intelligence. It's different than other therapeutic methods. And so we're being given the responsibility to make sure that once therapists are able to prescribe this and deliver it to people, that they have learned how it became approved and how it was proved safe and efficacious. However, they can modify the method any way they want to. That's what's called prescribing off-label. So we're not going to control once people are approved. So they'll be able to innovate. And also we are funding studies with some of the Veterans Administration trained therapists and some of the top PTSD researchers who have developed non-drug psychotherapies for PTSD, prolonged exposure, cognitive behavioral therapy, cognitive processing therapy. And we're actually funding studies for them to blend MDMA with their own methods. Maybe they'll come up with a better method. We're doing it primarily to teach the experts in PTSD research the value of MDMA. And so we're fine if they come up with other methods. But we do have the obligation, both from the EMA and from the FDA, to train the therapists. And as I said, I don't think we'll be the only company doing that, certainly not after it goes generic. But I do want to be the only company until we're assured that somebody else can do it as good or better than we can.
Not sure to start there. Okay, so just one comment on microdosing, since that came up. So I wouldn't rule out any use of a psychedelic as potentially beneficial, and I'm interested in seeing research and all that. But I also think that's probably the use that is most easily incorporated into capitalism and the most non-threatening and non-revolutionary use. At the same time, I recognize people use all types of drugs for all kinds of reasons, and so if it helps somebody with their depression or whatever it is that they're using it for, who am I to say don't do that, or that's a wrong way to use it? So, but I'm more skeptical that use could have the transformative potential, or that's going to kind of lead to broader acceptance in the culture, because I think the experience is not comparable in any way to a full dose experience. And then just for my final comments, I would say if some of you are out there thinking that you're in agreement that the role of capitalism and for-profit in the psychedelic space is problematic, and you're not sure what to do about it, I would say stop trying to figure out what to do about it, and instead talk to other people about what to do about it. So I think our best solutions come from collective efforts. Just two things that have happened in the last year that I've been involved, three things really that have happened in the last year that I've been involved with, which were all this collective effort, was one, organizing a drug users union in Chicago. So people can advocate for themselves in the media and drug policy, wherever else, do harm reduction with each other. It was starting a harm reduction and integration group for people who use psychedelics, so that they can know how to mitigate the risks and then also process either positive or negative experiences they've had. And then lastly, organizing around creating safe consumption spaces where people can use all drugs. So, but those are all things that I just, with a group of people, just started talking about that. And then sometimes when you start talking about things, you actually end up doing them. So I would say don't rack your brain about how to resist capitalism. Like I would suggest for MAPS, maybe that should be a standing item on your agenda at the meetings or something. It's like, how do we resist capitalism this week? But just to talk about it collectively.
So Bob keeps avoiding names. I'd just like to throw out there, the company is Eleusis. In 2015, they filed a patent for LSD for Alzheimer's. Look it up, it's on Google. I think it's really interesting, the number of clinicians and other folks that make comments about how political and social systems work, when if we came into a lab and made similar comments about how the lab works or proposed a clinical study, we'd probably get laughed out. And so like when we're talking about like fascists, it feels important to drive home the fact that Rick and I had a conversation at Entheogenesis Australis where he informed me that as a Jew, he didn't feel it was appropriate to punch people like Richard Spencer. I informed him that as a Jew, I felt the only way you engage with Richard Spencer is to punch him. Again, history is drenched with the blood of what happens when you let folks like this get power. When authoritarians get power, they use that power. We suffer for it. Additionally, I guess as final comments, literally everything that I raised on that question page is happening. I've got evidence for most of it. I've got indications for most of it. I'm looking to that will be coming out in the coming months. And seriously, y'all, most of that, if you start digging through the compass, who's who, look at Thomas Lundgren. The guy was the head of the EMA. He left. He started a consultancy company while he was still in the EMA. He left 2 months after that, and the watchdogs were like, oh, this looks a little off, but we're not quite sure. 7 months after that, 2 independent watchdog agencies were like, what the hell is this? Can we please get an investigation? It's all out there. It's not really well hidden. The amount of dirt that these people have been involved in is ridiculous. And the fact that there's defense of this, to my mind, this literally threatens the future of anybody who's interested in doing psychedelic research. The Isle of Man is not part of the EU. It's a regulatory haven. It's a tax haven. It's right. The reason that folks are looking at doing this stuff in the US is because we set the policy for the world. We are the most draconian prohibitionist country. If you can get legalization done here, theoretically you could get it done anywhere. So why the hell would we jeopardize that? Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, all of our presenters, for being here, for participating. Thank you, everyone in the audience, for being here. The last thing I will leave us with is that we are here because we all believe in this medicine, but we also are here because there's a massive global drug war. So please remember that at the base of all of this talk, that we're trying to end a war on drugs. And with that, we'll see you at 4 o'clock.
And group photo here. You're gonna make